Hello, welcome to the video. Today I'm going to be giving you my review of the SRAM Maven Base Brakes and explaining why I think they could be the perfect Maven if you typically prefer your brakes from the other big S cycling brand. I'm not sure if there's anything as divisive in the mountain bike world as what brakes you run, and while I've spent a fair amount of time on brakes from both SRAM and Shimano, historically my preferences have always lent towards the latter, but these brakes might just have changed that. For reference, I paid £162 per brake for these, which isn't exactly cheap, but for the performance on offer, I think they represent fantastic value. Also, I'm aware in some parts of the world, these are the cheapest Mavens you can get, and in others, the Maven Bronzes come in cheaper. So in North America, you can get the Maven Bronzes for cheaper than these, but in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, the Maven Bases actually come in cheaper than the Maven Bronzes. So I don't know why there's a difference depending on what location you're in, but for some people these will be cheaper, for the others the Maven Bronzes will be cheaper. I still think these brakes are great though. So like many riders, I've got a pretty mixed history with SRAM brakes. I've had two pairs of Guide R brakes in the past before on different bikes that I've ridden, and they were simply awful. All of the modulation, none of the power, and incredibly unreliable. I absolutely hated those brakes. More recently, I've been running the Code R brakes as my Norco Sight behind me, that's what the bike came with, and I was actually getting on pretty well with them. In the words of my friend Aidan, they feel a bit weird when you're stationary, but on the trail, they do everything you'd want a brake to do. And for the most part, I was very happy with the Code R brakes, but there were a few situations, particularly in hard sections of on-off braking, where they just didn't have enough power or bite for my liking, and I found myself considering some different brakes. Now, realistically, I probably could have remedied my issues with the Code R simply with a fresh bleed and some new discs. But where's the fun in that? I'm in New Zealand at the moment and there's some steep, spicy trails here, and if there's one component you really want to have some confidence in, it's going to be your brakes. Compared to all the other SRAM Mavens you could buy, I'd say the Maven Base is probably the least visually appealing. They are literally just black with Maven written on them. Their aesthetic is as base model and no nonsense as you can get, which I actually quite like, but I'm aware that's not going to be for everyone. In terms of their design, they lack a few of the features that fancier Mavens get, with 4 18mm pistons per caliper rather than two 19.5 and two 18mm pistons that the fancier Mavens get. Alongside this, the Maven Base utilises a direct link in the lever rather than a swing link. So with a direct link, the power from the lever is applied to the caliper in a linear fashion. With the swing link, which you'll find on all other models of Maven brake, the lever actually utilises a cam, which means the further you pull it, the higher the power will ramp up. I think the direct link in these levers is what gives it such a nice, light and responsive feel, but I'll talk about that more a little bit later on. I should say at this point, please like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. We're trying to get some momentum behind this YouTube thing at the moment, and some more subscribers would help me out massively. If you don't want to, that's also fine, but maybe you could just move your mouse over to that subscribe button and give it a little click. Cheers. The only external adjustment available on these brakes is a tool-free reach adjust, and the lever sits on bushings rather than bearings. We'll see how these hold up, because historically SRAM do not have the best reputation for bushing-based levers, but I might have a solution for this. You'll have to keep watching to the end of the video to find out what that could be though. So setup for these brakes was actually pretty simple, but that's because I didn't really do any of it. The bleed kit I ordered for them didn't arrive in time for a riding trip I had planned, so I took my bike down to Benny's Bikes in Auckland, who very kindly managed to squeeze me in at the last minute and get my brakes fitted and bled. From my research, the bleed procedure for these brakes is broadly the same as other SRAM brakes that use a bleeding edge port, except they use mineral oil rather than dot fluid. Where the setup of these brakes differ is with the piston massage procedure. And while that sounds like something a diesel mechanic would get up to on a passionate late night alone in the workshop, it is apparently quite an important part of getting these brakes set up. If you're going to do this bit yourself, there's a really good video on the SRAM YouTube channel that talks you through how to do it, but essentially what you do is remove the pads from the caliper, insert the special SRAM tool or two SRAM centerline rotors, and compress the lever until all the pistons from the caliper touch the tool or the rotors. Then you remove the tool or the rotors and gently put back those pistons, careful not to remove them from the caliper, and then your brakes are set up and ready to go. So SRAM actually include a tool with the brakes to do this procedure yourself, but for my money it's actually ever so slightly too thin. When all the pistons are against the tool, it looks like they are dangerously close to popping out the caliper. And I could see how if you weren't very careful putting those pistons back into the caliper, you could quite easily remove one, and then you'd have to completely reset your caliper, redo your bleed, and it would just be a massive pain in the arse. So I've read online that a lot of people recommend using a 4mm Allen key for this instead. A 4mm Allen key is actually ever so slightly thicker than this tool, and I think that's what I'll be doing in the future, just because it's going to give me a bit more peace of mind, and I really don't want to have to reset any pistons or redo a bleed, because that's just not fun. So for my first few days riding these brakes, I was actually in Rotorua, just doing endless shuttle laps and lots of descending, and to me it felt like the perfect place to get to grips with these brakes. I started riding them with some knackered old SRAM centerline rotors and the stock organic pads that the brakes come with, and as soon as the pads were bedded in, the power on these brakes was immediately very impressive. They have a super light lever feel, dare I say quite Shimano-esque in that regard, and the power on tap is really quite something. Definitely a step above any brake that I've experienced in the past. As soon as I got the pads bedded in, I was just doing endless nose pivots and stoppies, purely because it was so easy and predictable to lock up the front wheel. For a moment there, these brakes had me feeling like a trials rider, but unfortunately, I don't quite have the skills to back up that dream. So for my first day riding these, I stuck with these stock organic pads that the brakes come with, and I was actually very impressed by them. I would never normally run organic or resin pads, purely because I'm from the UK, it rains a lot there, and in those conditions, organic pads don't typically work too well. But I was actually very impressed with these pads, and I would consider running them again. So after a day running the organic pads, I swapped out to some new 203mm rotors kindly supplied by Outspoken Cycles and the SRAM sintered OEM pads. I'll link to the discs that I swapped to down below, but I just want to say a big shout out to Outspoken Cycles for sending me them. Any support of the channel is very much appreciated, and it's made a big difference to these brakes. With the new discs and sintered pads, the power really stepped up a level with these brakes. It was actually a little bit unnerving how easy it was to lock up the rear wheel, and it took me a few runs to readjust my brain and my fingers to the power that was on tap. Speaking of power, it's there pretty much immediately with these brakes, and they don't have the typical SRAM modulation that I've experienced in their other products. I would actually say the power is delivered in a way very similar to Shimano brakes, but with a few caveats. With Shimano brakes, you hit the bubble of power pretty much immediately after a very light initial lever feel. To me, it then feels like you modulate that power with how hard you squeeze the bubble. I know that sounds a bit weird, but to me that is the best way of describing the Shimano braking experience. With the Maven Base Brakes, you also hit that bubble of power very, very quickly, but because there is so much more power on tap, it requires much less force at the lever to achieve the same range of braking power. If you're somebody who likes quite a binary feeling brake with quite an on-off sensation and a quick ramp up in power, you will love these brakes. Once again, they're quite similar to Shimano in that regard, but with just way more power. Also like Shimano brakes, when the pads touch the rotor, that moment is very clearly communicated through the lever and very clearly defined. So if that's another sensation you like with your brakes, these are the ones for you. Because you don't need to pull the lever very far in terms of distance to achieve a usable range of braking power, you could run the levers on these brakes super close to the grip if you wanted to. You could practically run them against the grip and you'd still have enough power. I wouldn't recommend it, but you could. So if you're somebody with small hands or a very limited range of movement in your fingers, these brakes are going to work really well for you. I also noticed no discernible brake fade on some long, steep descents with these brakes. A lot of the trails I was riding when I was initially testing these out, I actually hadn't ridden before, and I feel like that's a really hard testing ground for some new brakes, because realistically, you don't know the braking zones, and you're either going to be braking way too late or riding the brakes way more than you should, and they're going to be having to work a lot harder than they would normally. There's going to be a lot more heat and probably a lot more force, and these brakes, despite my sloppy riding technique, never let me down. If it sounds like I'm a big fan of the Maven Base Brakes, that's because I am. My main reason for running Shimano brakes in the past was A, the super light lever feel, and B, the binary sensation with the sharp ramp up in power. Along with that, Shimano always had a really defined moment when the pads contacted the rotor, and these brakes also have that feature. So really, to me, they feel like Shimano brakes, just with significantly more power. And for me, that's a win. So while I really like these brakes, they aren't quite perfect, and there's actually some modifications I'm considering to make them even better. The main one is finding a way to put some bearings in this lever blade. So historically, on old level and guide brakes, it was pretty easy to put bearings into a base model lever and make them feel way nicer. I'm not sure if it's so easy to do with these brakes. I'm currently looking at some diagrams of SRAM Ultimate levers and other SRAM fancy levers to see if there's a way we could get some bearings into these levers and get them feeling even better. If you have some insider info on how to get bearings into these levers, please let me know how to do it down below. I'll probably do a part 2 of this video if we work out how to do it, but imagine how good these would feel with bearings in the lever. It would increase their longevity, and if there's one thing we need in the mountain bike world, it's making our components last longer, because this stuff ain't cheap. Also, imagine this lovely light lever with an even stronger caliper. So it looks like you could easily attach this lever to any of the fancier Maven brakes, and then you would have a crisp, light lever with even more power than these brakes, and to be honest, you would be unstoppable. Or rather, the complete opposite of unstoppable. Anyway, that's just a brainworm that I'm working on at the minute. I think it's possible, but I might need some external help to get this done, and maybe a little bit of bodging. I absolutely love these brakes, but as ever, there's always room for improvement. And I think that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching if you've got this far. If you've got any comments, any questions, please let me know down below. What brakes are you running? Let's get some brake chat in the comments. I know that Mavens in general have been fairly contentious within the mountain bike community, but my experience with these has been fantastic. But your experience could differ. So please let me know down below. Let's get a bit of a chat going. Once again, thank you for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.